Imagine a warrior whose armor was so perfectly engineered that arrows simply bounced off like raindrops on stone. Yet he could move faster than men wearing nothing but cloth. Sound impossible? It happened. And not just once. But the world of ancient warfare holds far more than the simple clashes of metal we see in movies. Buried deep in forgotten battlefields and crumbling manuscripts are accounts of warriors whose mastery of armor and blade reached levels that modern historians struggle to explain. Men who wore 60 pounds of steel yet fought for hours without exhaustion. Swords forged with techniques we still can't replicate today. Combat systems so sophisticated they turned individual fighters into walking fortresses. These weren't myths or legends inflated by time. Archaeological evidence proves their armor could stop weapons that would pierce modern Kevlar. Metallurgical analysis shows blade compositions that shouldn't have been possible with ancient technology. Battle records document feats that sound like fantasy but are carved into the stone of history itself. Today, we'll uncover 7 of the most legendary warrior armors in history, each one more formidable than the last. And the first one? He wore armor that weighed less than a modern bulletproof vest but could stop a charging warhorse. Warrior 1, the cataphract of Parthia. The year is 53 BC. A Roman general named Crassus, one of the richest and most powerful men in Rome, leads 40,000 legionaries into the desert near Carrhae. He's expecting an easy victory. What he encounters instead is something Rome has never seen before. A wall of steel appears on the horizon. Not men wearing armor. Not even cavalry in mail. But something that looks like a single, gleaming creature. Horse and rider fused into one unstoppable machine. The Parthian cataphract. And Crassus is about to learn why this warrior represents the pinnacle of ancient armored combat. Here's what made the cataphract different from every other mounted warrior of his time. Total enclosure. While Roman cavalry wore bronze plates over vital areas, the cataphract disappeared inside overlapping steel scales that covered him from helmet to boot. His horse? Equally armored. Front plate, side panels, even a steel mask over the face. Together, warrior and mount carried over 120 pounds of armor. Yet they could charge at full gallop. How? The secret wasn't just the armor. It was the training regime that turned both man and beast into a single fighting organism. A cataphract began his training at age 7. Not learning to ride, Persian boys learned that at age 4. No, at 7, he learned to ride in full armor. Every day. 4 hours. Building the specific muscles needed to control a horse while encased in steel, while wielding a 12-foot lance that weighed 15 pounds. But here's where it gets fascinating. The armor itself was a masterpiece of engineering that modern metallurgists still study. Each scale, and a full suit contained over 1,400 of them, was individually forged from high-carbon steel, then heat-treated to create a hard exterior while maintaining a flexible core. This meant arrows couldn't penetrate, but the warrior could still move. The Romans at Carrhae learned this the hard way. When the cataphracts charged, Roman javelins, weapons that could punch through standard mail, simply skittered off the scaled surface. When the Romans formed defensive squares, the cataphracts' contis lances, held in 2 hands, drove straight through shields and into the men behind them. And when Roman soldiers tried to close distance for hand-to-hand combat, the cataphracts drew their swords. And what swords they were! The Parthian cavalry sword wasn't the short gladius of Rome. It was a 36-inch cutting blade designed specifically for use from horseback while wearing heavy armor. The blade's curve, a gentle arc, not the dramatic sweep of later sabers, allowed the rider to deliver devastating cuts using the horse's momentum, even when his own arm motion was restricted by steel scales. But the real genius was in the sword's balance point. Positioned just 3 inches from the guard, it made the weapon feel weightless in the hand despite being over 3 pounds of steel. A cataphract could fight for hours, delivering cut after cut, without his arm fatiguing. Roman swords, balanced at the midpoint, exhausted wielders after minutes of sustained combat. The Battle of Carrhae ended with 20,000 Romans dead and another 10,000 captured. Crassus himself was executed. And Rome learned a lesson they would never forget. Some warriors don't just wear armor, they become it. But here's what's even more remarkable, and what most historians overlook. The cataphract wasn't just protected by his armor. He was psychologically weaponized by it. Contemporary accounts describe the terror Roman soldiers felt facing these iron warriors. The complete enclosure meant you couldn't see the man inside. No face, no eyes, just a steel form that absorbed your best attacks and kept coming. Modern psychologists call this dehumanization effect. Ancient soldiers just called it fear, and that fear made them easier to kill. The cataphract's armor system survived for nearly 800 years, from the Parthians through the Sassanids and into the Byzantine era. Why? Because no one found a better solution to the fundamental problem of mounted combat: how to deliver devastating charges while surviving the counterattack. Yet, for all their success, cataphracts had one critical weakness, and our next warrior discovered it, then built an entire combat system around exploiting it. Warrior 2, the samurai of feudal Japan. The year is 1274. Mongol forces, fresh from conquering most of Asia, land on the shores of Kyushu, Japan. They're expecting another easy victory. After all, their composite bows and cavalry tactics have crushed every army they've faced. But when they encounter Japanese samurai, something happens that the Mongol commanders can't explain. Their arrows are working. Samurai are being hit, but they're not falling. Welcome to the world of Oyoroi, the great armor, and the warrior who mastered it so completely that he turned defense into an art form that would last 700 years. Here's what the Mongols didn't understand. Samurai armor wasn't designed like anything they'd encountered. Where steppe warriors wore layers of leather and metal to stop arrows, samurai wore something far more sophisticated. A system that didn't just stop missiles, but distributed their impact across the entire body. The secret was in the construction method: kozain, small individual scales of iron or hardened leather, laced together with silk cords in a specific pattern called kebikyodoshi. Each scale overlapped the one below it, creating thousands of articulation points. When an arrow struck, the impact didn't concentrate on a single plate that might crack or puncture. Instead, it dispersed through dozens of scales, spreading the force so widely that the warrior barely felt it. But this wasn't even the most ingenious part. The silk cords that held the scales weren't just fasteners. They were shock absorbers. When an arrow hit, the cords stretched microscopically, absorbing kinetic energy before it reached the warrior's body. Modern tests show that Oyoroi could reduce impact force by up to 60% compared to solid plate armor. The samurai had accidentally discovered principles of trauma engineering that wouldn't be formalized in the West for another 600 years. Now here's where the samurai's mastery becomes clear. The armor's design wasn't static. It evolved based on the specific combat challenges each generation faced. When facing primarily arrow fire, they adjusted the angle of scale overlap. When cavalry charges became common, they modified the thickness of shoulder and chest plates. The armor was a living system, constantly optimized by warriors who tested every modification in actual battle. And the sword? That's where the samurai achieved something no other culture matched. The katana wasn't just a weapon, it was a solution to a specific problem. How do you cut through armor while wearing armor? The answer lay in metallurgy so advanced that modern bladesmiths struggle to replicate it. The forging process took months. Start with 2 types of steel: high carbon for hardness, low carbon for flexibility. Fold them together, not the 1,000 times that movies claim, but a precise 12 to 15 times, creating around 8,000 layers. Any more and the carbon content becomes too uniform, losing the blade's essential properties. Any less and the layers don't bond properly. Then came the differential hardening process called yakiaya. The blade was coated with clay, thick on the back, thin on the edge, then heated to exactly 750 to 800 degrees Celsius, 1,382 to 1,472 degrees Fahrenheit. At this temperature, the steel's crystal structure transforms. The smith could see it happening. The blade would glow a specific shade of orange-red that masters learned to recognize in absolute darkness. Then, the quench. Plunging the blade into water caused the thinly coated edge to cool rapidly, forming martensite, an extremely hard crystal structure. The thickly coated back cooled slowly, remaining as pearlite, a flexible structure. The result? A blade with a Rockwell hardness of 60 on the edge, harder than most modern tools, and 40 on the back, flexible enough to absorb impact without shattering. This differential hardness created the katana's legendary cutting ability. The hard edge could slice through bamboo armor and iron plates. The flexible back prevented the blade from snapping when it struck bone or shield rims. A well-made katana could cut through a European longsword without chipping, and several documented tests from the 16th century prove it did exactly that. But the samurai's true mastery wasn't in the sword or armor alone. It was in how he used them together. The fighting style called kenjutsu was specifically designed for combat in armor. Every cut, every stance, every footwork pattern assumed you were wearing 50 to 60 pounds of oyoroi. The famous two-handed overhead cut, immortalized in countless films, wasn't aesthetic. It was the only way to generate sufficient force to cut through an enemy's armor when your own armor restricted your shoulder rotation. Watch how a samurai drew his sword. The motion called nukiwaza wasn't a quick draw like Western fast draw shooting. It was a smooth, controlled extraction that accounted for the armor's shoulder guards. The blade had to clear the soyo, scabbard, without catching on the osode, large shoulder plates. A samurai practiced this draw 1,000 times before his teacher would let him attempt it in full armor. Master swordsmen could draw and cut in a single motion that took 0.7 seconds, faster than most people can blink twice. The psychological dimension was just as sophisticated. Samurai armor was deliberately designed to be beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The helmet's maidate, front crest, was often shaped like demon horns or crescents, making the warrior appear taller and more imposing. The menpo, face mask, was formed to look like a snarling demon, complete with detachable nose and mustache. Why? Because in the chaos of medieval battle, your appearance could make enemies hesitate for a crucial second. And in sword combat, a second means life or death. But here's what makes the samurai's mastery truly remarkable. They achieved all this without steel initially. Early Japanese swords were made from iron sand, tamahagane, because Japan has almost no iron ore deposits. They had to develop a smelting process so efficient it could extract usable steel from sand. The Tatara furnace they invented produced steel with fewer impurities than European blast furnaces did 300 years later. One samurai, Miyamoto Musashi, took this mastery to its ultimate conclusion. He fought over 60 duels and never lost. His secret? He understood that armor and sword weren't separate tools but a single system. In his final duel, against the renowned swordsman Sasaki Kojiro, Musashi showed up wearing no armor at all. Why? Because he'd studied Kojiro's style and knew his opponent's sword. The legendary 3-foot-long Nadachi required specific timing. Without armor's weight, Musashi could move unpredictably, disrupting that timing. He killed Kojiro with a single strike. Yet even Musashi would have struggled against our next warrior. Because where the samurai mastered the blade, this man transformed armor itself into a weapon. Warrior 3, the Knight Templar of the Crusades. The year is 1177. A 16-year-old king with leprosy, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, faces Saladin's army of 26,000 men. Baldwin has 500 knights. The mathematics of the situation are simple. Each knight must somehow defeat 52 enemies. It's impossible, unless you're a Knight Templar. And 83 of Baldwin's 500 knights are Templars. By sunset, Saladin's army is in full retreat, having lost 90% of its fighting force. How? Because the Templar Knight had turned armorcraft into a science that bordered on supernatural. Here's what made Templar armor different. It was the first truly systematic approach to protection in Western history. While other knights bought whatever armor their local blacksmith could make, Templars followed written specifications, documented rules that dictated every measurement, every metal thickness, every strap placement. They essentially created the first military equipment standards, 700 years before armies formalized such concepts. The Templar Great Helm, for instance, wasn't just a bucket over your head. It was an engineered solution to multiple problems simultaneously. The flat top deflected downward sword strikes. The narrow eye slit prevented arrows from finding the face while still allowing peripheral vision through clever angular geometry. The helm extended far enough down the neck to overlap with the mail coif underneath, creating double-layer protection. And here's the genius part. The entire helm was slightly cone-shaped internally, so that any blow strong enough to dent the outer surface would still leave a half-inch gap before reaching the skull. It was essentially the world's first crumple zone, using the same principles modern cars employ. But the helm was just the beginning. The Templar combat system was built on a radical idea: full protection at all costs. Where other knights might sacrifice arm or leg armor for mobility, Templars covered everything. Mail from neck to ankle. Plate reinforcement on chest, shoulders, elbows, and knees. Even their hands disappeared inside mittens of mail and leather. A fully armored Templar had perhaps 5% of his body surface exposed. Compare that to Saracen cavalry, whose armor left 30 to 40% exposed for mobility. But how could they fight effectively while wearing so much armor, you ask? And that's where the Templar training system, possibly the most rigorous in medieval history, comes in. A Templar sergeant, before he could even attempt to become a knight, spent 2 years doing nothing but armor drills. Not sword training, not horseback riding, just learning to move in 60 pounds of steel. They started with short sessions, 15 minutes in full armor, doing basic movements. Then 30 minutes. Then an hour. By the end of year 1, a recruit could spend 8 hours in armor without significant fatigue. By year 2, the armor felt like a second skin. The difference this made in combat is hard to overstate. While enemy warriors tired after an hour of fighting, Templars were just warming up. Battle accounts from the Crusades repeatedly describe Templar knights fighting from dawn until dusk, maintaining the same intensity throughout. This wasn't superhuman endurance, it was conditioning so thorough that the armor literally became part of their body schema, the neurological map your brain uses to track your physical form. Now for the sword. The Templar arming sword wasn't flashy or exotic. It was 36 inches of cross-hilt steel that looked almost boring compared to the curved sabers of their enemies. But boring is exactly what made it perfect. The straight, double-edged blade was designed for one purpose: punching through mail. When you're wearing heavy armor and fighting enemies also in armor, you don't need fancy cuts. You need force concentration. The tapered point of the arming sword could slip between mail rings, through the gaps in plate armor, into the vulnerable joints at armpit, elbow, and behind the knee. It was a surgical tool disguised as a weapon. The sword's balance was equally purposeful. Medieval swords weren't the heavy, clumsy implements movies show. A Templar arming sword weighed 2.5 to 3 pounds and balanced 3 to 4 inches from the crossguard. This meant you could change the direction of a strike mid-motion, essential when fighting in the chaos of close combat where opponents come from multiple angles simultaneously. But here's what separated Templar swordsmanship from everyone else. They trained for armor-to-armor combat exclusively. While other fighting systems assumed you might face unarmored opponents, Templars trained as if every enemy wore full plate. This meant their techniques focused on precision over power. A Templar knight aimed for gaps, not surfaces. He didn't try to cut through armor, he tried to find its weak points. The fighting manual from the 13th century, I.33, the oldest surviving European combat treatise, shows these techniques. There's a specific sequence called the priest's guard, where the swordsman holds his weapon vertically in front of his face, using the blade itself as a shield while looking for an opening. When he found it, the strike was a straight thrust to the enemy's visor or neck joint. Fast, economical, lethal. This precision was possible because of training volume that bordered on obsessive. Historical records show Templars practiced swordplay for a minimum of 2 hours daily. Not sporadic practice, structured drilling of specific techniques, repeated until they became automatic. By the time a Templar saw actual combat, he'd executed basic strikes tens of thousands of times. His body knew what to do before his mind registered the threat. The combination of armor conditioning and weapon mastery created something terrifying on the battlefield. A warrior who simply wouldn't stop. Contemporary accounts describe Templars continuing to fight with multiple arrow wounds, sword cuts, even lost fingers. Not because they were suicidally brave, but because their armor had protected them enough that these wounds, while painful, weren't immediately disabling. At the Battle of Montgazard, that 500 versus 26,000 engagement, this system proved its worth. Templar knights formed the heavy cavalry spearhead of Baldwin's charge. Their armor turned Saracen arrows into minor nuisances. Their swords found the gaps in lighter Arabic armor. And their conditioning meant they could maintain a sustained charge that broke through 3 separate Saracen defensive lines without pausing to regroup. Saladin himself, watching from a hill, reportedly couldn't understand what he was seeing. His archers were hitting their targets. His cavalry was engaged in melee. Yet the line of white-mantled knights kept coming, seemingly invulnerable, cutting down men like wheat before a scythe. It looked like divine intervention. It was actually just superior armor engineering and training discipline. But even the Templar system had a weakness that our next warrior exploited ruthlessly. Because while Templars mastered protection, this man mastered something more fundamental: momentum. Warrior 4, the Varangian Guard of Byzantium. The year is 988 AD. Byzantine Emperor Basil II has a problem. He's surrounded by potential assassins, ambitious generals, scheming courtiers. Even his own palace guards can't be fully trusted. He needs warriors who have no political connections, no local allegiances, no reason to betray him for power they could never hold in a foreign land. So he makes a deal with Vladimir, Prince of Kiev. Send me 6,000 of your most violent, most fearless warriors. Men who value gold over politics. Men who worship different gods and speak different tongues. Men who fight not for empire or ideology, but for the pure joy of killing and the promise of treasure. Vladimir sends the Varangians. And for the next 400 years, they'll be the Byzantine Empire's ultimate weapon. Warriors who took armor design in a radical new direction that would influence European warfare for centuries. Here's what made Varangian armor revolutionary. They rejected the Mediterranean approach entirely. While Byzantine cataphracts wore elaborate lamellar armor designed for cavalry warfare, and Italian knights were beginning to experiment with solid plate, the Varangians looked at the battlefield and saw a different problem requiring a different solution. Most armor was designed to stop cuts and arrows. The Varangians designed their armor to enable devastating attacks. The standard Varangian outfit looked almost primitive compared to contemporary Byzantine gear. A mail shirt called a brinja, knee-length, with sleeves to the elbow. A simple conical helmet with a nasal guard. Leather trousers reinforced with metal splints at the thighs. That's it. No elaborate plate. No layered lamellae. Compared to a fully equipped cataphract wearing 80 pounds of armor, a Varangian war may be 40. Why the minimalism? Because of what they carried in their hands. The Dane axe. A 2-handed weapon with a 4-foot haft and a 10-inch blade, weighing 4 to 5 pounds total. Light enough to swing for hours. Heavy enough to split a helmet and the skull beneath in a single overhead strike. And here's the crucial part. Using this weapon effectively required mobility that heavy armor made impossible. Watch how a Varangian fought. The axe attacks came from high, sweeping arcs that used the weapon's length to generate devastating momentum. The blade accelerated through a 6-foot radius before connecting with the target. Physics does the math. A 5-pound axe moving at 20 miles per hour delivers roughly 200 joules of kinetic energy to a surface area of about 10 square centimeters. That's 20 joules per square centimeter, enough to split iron plates, crush bone, and pulp tissue behind armor. But generating that velocity required specific body mechanics. The warrior had to rotate his entire torso, shift his weight from back foot to front, and time the arm extension precisely. Any armor heavy enough to restrict torso rotation would reduce the axe's effectiveness by 50% or more. So the Varangians chose offense over defense. They'd rather hit harder than be protected better. This created a fascinating dynamic on the battlefield. When Varangians faced heavily armored opponents, Templar knights, Norman cavalry, Pecheneg horse archers in plate, they had a significant reach advantage and kinetic energy superiority. A knight's sword might be stopped by mail. A Varangian axe went through mail and out the other side. But if the Varangian missed or his attack was blocked, his lighter armor made him vulnerable to counterattacks. So they developed combat tactics that minimized this risk. The shield wall. Not the Greek phalanx or Roman testudo, but something uniquely Scandinavian. A line of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, each man's round shield overlapping his neighbor's. The shields were 36 inches in diameter, larger than most European shields, made of lime with planks glued crosswise for strength, with an iron boss in the center. Here's the genius. The overlapping shields created a continuous wooden barrier 3 feet high and however long the formation needed to be. But unlike a static Roman shield wall, the Varangian version was fluid. When one warrior attacked with his axe, requiring both hands, the men on either side shifted their shields to cover his exposed body. The formation breathed, opening and closing gaps as individuals struck and recovered. This system worked so well that it held off cavalry charges that would have shattered most infantry formations. The Byzantines watched in amazement as Varangians, protecting the emperor during civil wars, stood against mounted cataphracts and didn't break. The horses wouldn't charge a solid shield wall, and the axe-wielding warriors behind it could reach mounted opponents when they tried to circle. But the Varangians' true innovation was social, not technical. They were the first professional military unit in medieval Europe, warriors who fought for pay, not feudal obligation. This changed everything. A feudal knight owned his armor and weapons. When they broke, he had to replace them at his own expense. So knights took care of their equipment, sometimes prioritizing its preservation over tactical effectiveness. A Varangian was issued his gear by the Byzantine state. If his axe broke, he got a new one. If his mail was damaged, it was repaired or replaced. This meant Varangians fought with an aggression that shocked their contemporaries. They didn't worry about preserving equipment, they worried about winning. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine you're a rebel Byzantine general facing the emperor's forces. You see the Varangian Guard advance, blonde bearded giants carrying axes that could split a horse, screaming in languages you don't understand, wearing armor that seems inadequate but moving with predatory purpose. They don't form neat lines like proper soldiers. They don't advance cautiously. They surge forward like a wave of violence, shields locked, axes rising and falling with mechanical precision. Chronicles from the Byzantine civil wars describe enemy formations simply breaking and running when the Varangians charged. Not because they were cowards, but because they'd seen what those axes did to armored men. The Varangians didn't wound or capture, they killed. A warrior hit by a Dane axe typically died, often messily. Armor didn't help. Shields slowed the blade slightly before it carved through. The only defense was not being there when the axe arrived. And the swords? Yes, the Varangians carried swords too, but not as primary weapons, as prestige items and backup tools. Their swords were the famous Ulfbert blades, imported from Frankish smiths, bearing a mysterious inscription that modern metallurgists have determined indicates crucible steel, a forging technique that produced blades of exceptional quality. An Ulfbert sword was a warrior's most valuable possession, worth as much as 300 cattle. The blade had a carbon content of 0.8 to 1.2%, creating a hardness that allowed it to hold an edge through extensive combat. These swords were status symbols, yes, but they were also perfectly practical. When an axe couldn't be used, in tight quarters, on narrow stairs, in the emperor's chambers, the Varangian drew his sword and became just as deadly in close combat. One Varangian, Harold Hardrada, demonstrated the effectiveness of this combat system across the medieval world. He fought in Jerusalem, Sicily, Bulgaria, and eventually became King of Norway. In 31 years of warfare, he reportedly never lost a battle. His tactics were pure Varangian: aggressive charges, devastating axe attacks, minimal armor for maximum mobility. When he finally died in England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, it took 20 English soldiers to bring him down, and even then he fought for several minutes with an arrow in his throat before falling. Yet for all their success, the Varangians never evolved. They perfected one combat system and stuck with it for 400 years. While European armor grew heavier and more sophisticated, Varangians kept wearing mail and swinging axes. Why? Because they didn't need to change. The system worked. Until they faced our next warrior. A man who understood that the greatest armor wasn't steel or mail, but something far more dangerous. But before moving on, I would like to ask you for something. If you like these documentaries and want to support me, please consider subscribing. It's free. Warrior 5, the Mughal Rajput of India. The year is 1576. Maharana Pratap, ruler of Mewar, faces the Mughal Emperor Akbar's army at Haldighati. Akbar commands 80,000 men, modern firearms, artillery. Pratap has 20,000 warriors, mostly cavalry. The Mughals expect this to be over in hours. The battle lasts 4 hours of continuous melee. When it ends, the Mughals control the battlefield but have lost 16,000 men. Pratap's forces have lost 8,000. Military historians still study this engagement because the casualty ratios make no sense, until you understand Rajput armor design and the warrior culture that made it effective. Here's what the Mughals didn't expect: armor that wasn't designed to defend, but to intimidate. Rajput warriors wore charana, the 4 mirrors, an armor system of 4 plates polished to a reflective sheen and connected by mail. Chest, back, and 2 side plates, each one curved to deflect blows and catch sunlight. In the harsh Indian sun, a charging line of Rajput cavalry looked like an advancing wall of fire, the mirrored plates throwing light in every direction. But the charana wasn't just psychological warfare. It was a solution to a specific environmental problem that European and Middle Eastern armor makers never had to consider: heat. Try wearing 60 pounds of European plate armor in 110 degrees Fahrenheit heat, 43 degrees Celsius. You'll last about 45 minutes before heat exhaustion begins. An hour before you're seriously impaired. 90 minutes before you're at risk of heat stroke. European knights fighting in the Crusades learned this the hard way. There are accounts of entire cavalry units dismounting and removing their armor mid-battle simply because they couldn't function anymore. The Rajputs solved this problem with elegant engineering. The charana plates were separated from the body by mail and padded cloth, creating air gaps that allowed ventilation. The polished surface reflected solar radiation rather than absorbing it. And the plates themselves were thinner than European armor, 3 mm versus 5 mm, because Rajput metallurgy allowed them to create harder steel that provided equivalent protection at lower weight. How did they make harder steel? They discovered crucible steel independently, calling it woods. The process involved sealing iron ore and charcoal in a clay crucible, then heating it for days at temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, 2,192 degrees Fahrenheit. The result was a metal with carbon nanoparticles that made it harder than anything being produced in Europe at the time. Wood steel had another remarkable property: it was flexible. A blade made from properly forged woods could be bent 90 degrees and spring back to straight. This meant Rajput swords, the curved talwar, could deliver cuts that would shatter European blades without breaking. The talwar deserves its own examination. Unlike the straight swords of Europe or the heavily curved scimitars of Persia, the talwar had a moderate curve, about 15 degrees along the blade's length. This curve served multiple purposes. First, it made draw cuts devastatingly effective. In cavalry combat, you're moving past your opponent at high speed. A straight blade requires a direct hit perpendicular to the target, difficult when both of you are moving. A curved blade allows you to strike at an angle, drawing the edge across the target as you pass. The curve multiplies the cutting length by a factor of 2 to 3, creating wounds that are longer, deeper, and far more likely to sever major blood vessels. Second, the curve changed the sword's point of impact. The tip of a curved blade strikes first, followed by the rest of the edge in a sliding motion. This concentrates force at the initial point of contact while the sliding motion soars through whatever the tip has pierced. Medieval armor could sometimes deflect straight sword strikes. Against a curved blade's tip and slide attack, armor was much less effective. But the talwar's real secret was in its balance. The blade was weighted toward the tip, deliberately making it more blade-heavy than European swords. This seems counterintuitive. Won't a blade-heavy sword be harder to control? Not if you're fighting from horseback using specific cutting techniques. The Rajputs discovered that a tip-heavy sword uses gravity and momentum to generate cutting power with minimal arm strength. When you raise the sword overhead and let it fall while guiding it toward your target, the weight distribution accelerates the tip faster than a balanced blade would move. The cut delivers more energy with less effort from the warrior. This meant Rajput cavalry could fight for extended periods without arm fatigue, crucial in battles that often lasted hours. The cutting technique itself was called talwar ki kalam, the art of the talwar. It involved specific body positions designed for use from horseback while wearing armor. The warrior didn't swing from the shoulder like European knights. He used his whole torso, pivoting at the waist while keeping his arm relatively straight. This generated blade speed from core rotation rather than arm strength, and it worked perfectly with the Charena armor design, which didn't restrict torso movement. Watch a master perform Talwar Ki Kalam and you'll see something that looks like dance. Fluid, circular movements. The blade makes figure eights in the air, never stopping, always in motion. Why? Because a moving blade is harder to predict and harder to block. And with the Talwar's tip-heavy balance, these continuous movements weren't exhausting. The sword's own momentum kept it flowing from one position to the next. But the Rajputs' greatest innovation wasn't steel or swords or armor, it was cultural. They created a warrior ethos called Rajutana, which transformed combat from a practical necessity into a sacred duty. A Rajput warrior began training at age 7. Not just weapons training, but studies in history, poetry, and ethics. By age 14, he'd memorized the deeds of legendary warriors from his clan. By 16, he'd fought in at least one battle as a squire to a senior warrior. By 21, he received his first independent command. This cultural system meant every Rajput on the battlefield wasn't just technically skilled, he was psychologically prepared to fight to the death rather than retreat. European knights fought for feudal obligation or pay. Varangians fought for gold. Rajputs fought because their entire identity was built around warrior values. Retreat wasn't just militarily unacceptable, it was spiritually impossible. This created a tactical flexibility that shocked Mughal commanders. At Haldighati, when the Mughal center broke through Rajput lines, instead of routing, the Rajput warriors simply reformed and counterattacked from multiple angles. They didn't need orders. They didn't need time to regroup. Each warrior knew the tactics, trusted his equipment, and fought with absolute commitment. Maharana Pratap himself embodied this system. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting in the thick of battle, his polished charena flashing in the sun, his talwar cutting through Mughal soldiers like paper. When his horse was killed under him, he simply commandeered another and kept fighting. When his armor was damaged by a lance thrust that should have killed him, he had a blacksmith repair it on the battlefield while the fighting continued around them. The battle ended when Pratap was finally surrounded by dozens of Mughal warriors. But even then, he didn't surrender. His bodyguards formed a protective circle, and they fought their way out, cutting through the Mughal lines and escaping into the Aravalli hills. Akbar controlled the battlefield but hadn't captured or killed his opponent. By Rajput standards, this meant the battle was a draw, not a defeat. For the next 25 years, Pratap continued guerrilla warfare against the Mughals, never surrendering, never accepting Mughal authority. He died in 1597 from injuries sustained in battle, still fighting, still wearing his charena, still carrying his talwar. Yet for all the Rajput mastery of armor and blade, they faced a problem that no amount of steel could solve. The warrior code sometimes overrode tactical sense. And our next fighter understood this weakness perfectly, because he'd learned to remove emotion from combat entirely. Warrior 6, the Ottoman Janissary. The year is 1453. Constantinople has stood for over 1,000 years, defended by walls that have never been breached. Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II has something no previous besieger possessed: 10,000 Janissaries. And within 53 days, the unconquerable city will fall. Not because of better cannons, though the Ottomans had those. Not because of superior numbers, though they had those too. But because the Janissaries represented a radical reimagining of what a warrior could be when you removed everything that made warriors traditionally human. Here's the foundation. Janissaries weren't born into warrior families. They were Christian boys, taken from their homes at age 8 to 10 through a system called devshirme, collection. They were converted to Islam, given Turkish names, and raised in barracks where their only family was their military unit. They had no inheritance to worry about, no home to return to, no identity outside the core. They were weapons forged from human material. This social engineering created something unprecedented in medieval warfare. Soldiers who followed orders absolutely. No feudal knight would charge certain death if his lord commanded it. He had a family estate to consider, heirs to protect. No tribal warrior would hold position when retreat made sense. he had a clan reputation to maintain. Janissaries? They did what they were told without hesitation, because they literally had nothing else. But the Ottomans didn't stop at psychological conditioning. They optimized everything about Janissary equipment for one purpose: breakthrough assault against fortified positions. And that required rethinking armor from first principles. Traditional medieval armor was designed for mounted combat or open-field battles. Heavy, comprehensive protection because the warrior might face attacks from any angle. Janissaries didn't need that. They attacked fortified walls, meaning threats came from one direction, forward. So their armor protected the front while leaving the back relatively light. The Janissary helmet, the distinctive sisak with its tall spike, wasn't decorative. The spike served as a crumple zone. When rocks or boiling water were dropped from walls above, they'd hit the spike first, which would bend and absorb energy before the impact reached the helmet proper. The spike also made it difficult for defenders to get a straight downward strike onto the crown of the helmet, where even the best armor was most vulnerable. The breastplate was another engineering solution. While European breastplates were rounded to deflect blows, the Janissary domed breastplate was designed specifically to deflect missiles coming from above. Arrows and crossbow bolts shot downward from walls would glance off the curved surface rather than punching through. This seemingly small design change increased survival rates by roughly 40% in siege warfare. But here's where the Janissary system became truly sophisticated. They didn't all wear the same armor. The corps was divided into specialized units, and each had equipment optimized for its specific role. The first wave assault troops, called Surdanjekti, those who lose their heads, wore minimal armor. Just a helmet and a thin breastplate. Why? Because their job was to reach the walls fast, plant siege ladders, and climb before defenders could concentrate fire. Every pound of armor they left behind meant they reached the walls a few seconds sooner. And in siege warfare, seconds decide survival. Right behind them came the heavily armored troops wearing full-plated armor, carrying large shields and short swords. Their job was to climb the ladders the first wave had planted and establish a foothold at the top of the wall. The heavy armor made climbing slower but necessary. Defenders would rain everything they had on anyone reaching the ramparts. Then came the firearm troops. Yes, firearms. The Janissaries were among the first European military units to standardize firearm use. Their matchlock muskets weren't accurate beyond 50 yards, but in siege warfare, you're shooting at mass defenders on a wall from close range. Accuracy isn't the priority, volume of fire is. And the Janissaries pioneered volifire tactics, where ranks would fire, kneel to reload, let the next rank fire, creating a continuous stream of bullets. The Janissary sword, the yataghan, was designed for close quarters fighting in the confined spaces of breached fortifications. It was a forward-curving sword, opposite of most Middle Eastern blades. This curve served a specific purpose. In narrow corridors or on cramped stairs, you can't make wide slashing cuts. The yataghan's forward curve allowed short, powerful chops in tight spaces. The blade was also single-edged with a very thin profile, making it light enough to use in rapid, repeated strikes. In close-quarters melee, the yataghan could deliver 3 to 4 cuts in the time a heavier sword made one. But the Janissaries' true innovation was tactical flexibility enabled by their diverse equipment. At the Siege of Constantinople, they used a rotating assault system. The first wave would attack for 30 minutes, then fall back to rest while a fresh wave went in. This meant defenders faced continuous pressure without respite, while attackers always had rested troops available. This system only worked because of something remarkable. The Janissaries didn't care about individual glory. European knights would compete to be first up the ladder, first through the breach, because individual heroic deeds brought prestige. Janissaries rotated on schedule. If your unit was told to withdraw at a specific time, you withdrew, even if you were winning. The unit's effectiveness was more important than any individual's achievement. The discipline this required was extraordinary. At one point during the Constantinople siege, a section of wall collapsed, creating a breach. A group of Byzantine defenders rushed to plug the gap. The Janissary wave that was scheduled to be attacking at that moment saw the opportunity, but also knew their relief wave was 10 minutes away. Standard military doctrine would say, exploit the breach now. The Janissaries held position for those 10 minutes, then withdrew on schedule, and the fresh wave went in at full strength and took the breach. This discipline extended to their swordsmanship. Janissaries didn't train flashy, individualistic fighting styles. They drilled specific sequences designed for unit combat. When 3 Janissaries with yataghans engaged an enemy, they didn't each fight independently. One would engage high, one mid, one low. They'd rotate positions, creating a pattern of attacks that was nearly impossible to defend against because no defense worked for all 3 angles simultaneously. The training system was relentless. Janissaries practiced swordwork 2 hours daily, every day, for their entire careers. A 40-year-old Janissary veteran had performed basic cutting drills approximately 30,000 times. At that volume of repetition, techniques become autonomous. Your body executes them before your conscious mind processes the situation. But what made Janissaries truly formidable was something simpler and darker. They'd been psychologically conditioned to accept death. Not in some abstract, philosophical way, but practically. They lived in barracks from age 10 onward, sleeping in large communal rooms. Death was a constant presence. Comrades died in training, in battle, from disease. A Janissary saw more death by age 20 than most civilians experienced in a lifetime. This familiarity with mortality created warriors who didn't freeze in combat. Fear of death is what makes soldiers hesitate, duck behind cover when they should advance, break formation when casualties mount. Janissaries didn't overcome fear through courage. They overcame it through exposure and conditioning. Death was just part of the job. At Constantinople, when Mehmed ordered the final assault, he unleashed waves of Janissaries that simply wouldn't stop coming. Byzantine defenders killed hundreds, then hundreds more. The Janissaries kept climbing ladders, kept flooding through breaches, kept attacking. Not because they were brave or fanatical, but because they'd been trained since childhood that orders were absolute and death was acceptable. The city fell on May 29, 1453. The Byzantine Empire ended after 1,123 years. And the Ottoman Empire, riding the success of its Janissary corps, would dominate southeastern Europe and the Middle East for another 400 years. Yet even the Janissaries, for all their discipline and tactical sophistication, were still bound by one limitation. They were line troops. Elite, yes, but operating within formal military structures. Our final warrior rejected structures entirely. He was a one-man army whose armor and blade turned him into something legends are made from. Warrior 7, the medieval longsword master. The year is 1382. A traveling German swordmaster named Johannes Lichtenau has just killed his 7th opponent in judicial duels. Legal fights to the death where combat skill determines guilt or innocence. 7 challenges. 7 victories. 7 bodies. And Lichtenau isn't an aristocrat with the best armor money can buy. He's a commoner who's developed a fighting system so effective that nobles hire him to train their sons. And that system will influence European martial arts for the next 300 years. Here's what made the longsword master different from every warrior we've discussed. He fought alone. No unit tactics. No army support. No cavalry charges. Just one man, his armor, his sword, and his skill. And that changed everything. Start with the armor. When you're operating independently, you can't rely on a shield wall or supporting troops to protect your flanks. You need 360-degree protection. So the longsword masters pioneered the use of full-plate armor, complete steel enclosure from head to toe. But here's what most people don't understand about full plate. It wasn't the clumsy, restrictive burden movies portray. A properly fitted suit of Gothic plate armor, the style that emerged in 15th century Germany, weighed 45 to 55 pounds, and that weight was distributed across the entire body. You carried more weight in a modern military pack, except the pack hangs from your shoulders while armor spreads load across your frame. The articulation was extraordinary. Modern tests with accurately reconstructed Gothic plate show that warriors could perform cartwheels, climb ladders, mount horses unassisted, and fight continuously for hours. The armor's joints, particularly at the elbow, shoulder, and knee, used an overlapping design that allowed full range of motion while maintaining protection. The key was custom fitting. A master armorer would take dozens of measurements, create paper templates, forge the plates, then adjust them repeatedly until they moved with the warrior's body. The chest plate curved to match the warrior's actual torso. The arm pieces followed the natural angle of the biceps and forearm. When everything fit perfectly, wearing the armor felt like wearing a very tight, very heavy suit. But protection was only half the equation. The longsword master needed offense too. And the longsword, the iconic cruciform blade wielded in two hands, was the most versatile close combat weapon ever developed. The term longsword covered a variety of blade designs, but the typical German longsword was 40 to 48 inches of blade with a 10 to 12-inch grip, weighing 2.5 to 3.5 pounds. Light enough to control precisely, heavy enough to deliver devastating cuts. The blade was double-edged, tapered to a sharp point, and flexible enough to survive impacts with armor and bone. What made it special was the fighting system built around it. Lichtenor's art, Kunst des Fechtens, the art of fighting, treated the sword as 4 weapons in one. You could cut with either edge. You could thrust with the point. You could hook with the crossguard. You could strike with the pommel. A master could transition between all 4 modes fluidly in response to the tactical situation. The foundation was body mechanics, not blade work. Lichtenor taught that power came from the legs and core, transmitted through the arms to the sword. Every cut began with a weight shift. Every thrust originated from a hip rotation. The arms guided the blade, but the body provided force. This principle allowed longsword masters to generate terrifying cutting power despite the blade's relatively light weight. When you swing a 3-pound sword using just your arms, you might generate 50 to 60 joules of energy. When you swing that same sword using a full-body rotation starting from the legs, you can triple that energy. Enough to shear through mail, dent plate armor, or sever limbs through cloth and leather. But raw power wasn't the point. Control was. The longsword's versatility meant a master could attack from any angle, switch attack modes mid-motion, and flow between offense and defense without pause. The German masters called this principle flowing water. Like a stream that follows the path of least resistance, a longsword master's blade went wherever his opponent's defense was weakest. The techniques had evolved from 200 years of actual judicial combats. Fights where skill literally determined whether you lived or died. Techniques that didn't work got their practitioners killed, naturally selecting for effectiveness. By Lichtenor's time, the system had been refined to a core set of master strikes, 5 fundamental attacks that covered all the angles from which a human could deliver a two-handed cut. These weren't random slashes. Each master strike had a specific tactical purpose. The Zornhau, Wrath Strike, was an overhead diagonal cut delivered while stepping forward, designed to overwhelm an opponent's guard through sheer momentum. The Krumpfau, Crooked Strike, was a horizontal cut with the hands crossed, specifically designed to hook around an opponent's blade and strike their hands. The Zwerchhau, Thwart Strike, was a horizontal cut at head height. Delivered while stepping to the side, it avoided the opponent's blade entirely by changing the angle of attack. But the real genius was in the transitions. A master didn't throw one strike and wait to see what happened. He flowed from one attack directly into the next, creating combinations that kept opponents reactive. If your Zornhau was blocked, the block itself positioned your blade perfectly to transition into a Zwerchhau. If that was parried, you could immediately thrust with the point. The blade never stopped moving, never gave the opponent time to mount a counterattack. And when fighting in full plate armor, this continuous motion became even more crucial. Armor made you nearly immune to most cuts. A long sword blade simply couldn't generate enough force to cut through properly fitted plate. So the target was no longer the body, it was the armor's gaps. Armpits, backs of knees, inside of elbows, the visor of the helmet, groin. These joints needed flexibility, which meant thinner armor or no armor at all. A thrust to these locations could severely injure or kill. So combat between 2 armored longsword masters became a lethal game of precision, each fighter trying to land a thrust into a gap that might be 2 inches wide while preventing their opponent from doing the same. The technique for this was called Halbschwert, half-sword. The swordsman would grip the blade itself with his left hand halfway down its length, giving him greater control for precise thrusts. Sounds dangerous, grabbing a sharp blade, but with armored gauntlets on, you could grip the flat of the blade safely. This shortened the effective length of the weapon, making it more maneuverable in close distance, and allowed you to use the sword like a short spear, jabbing at gaps. There was another Halbschwert technique even more brutal. With your hand on the blade, you could use the crossguard as a hook to trap your opponent's sword. Then step in close and use the sword's pommel as a hammer, striking at your opponent's helmet. The pommel, the counterweight at the end of the grip, was often a solid knob of steel. Hitting someone's helmet with it was called Mordschlag, murder strike, and it could dent armor, cause concussions, even crack skulls through the helmet. But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of longsword combat was psychological. The masters understood that fighting wasn't just physical, it was mental. Lichtenau's teachings included a concept called Fühlen, feeling, which meant sensing your opponent's intentions through blade contact. When your sword touched your opponent's blade, you could feel their pressure. Were they pushing hard, trying to dominate? Or were they yielding, trying to redirect? A master could read this tactile information instantly and respond before his opponent completed their technique. It was like a conversation in steel, action and response, pressure and release, happening at speeds too fast for conscious thought. This psychological dimension is what separated masters from merely skilled fighters. Anyone could learn the techniques, but developing Fühlen required thousands of hours of sparring against varied opponents, building an intuitive understanding of blade dynamics that became instinctive. Records show that top longsword masters fought 20 to 30 judicial duels during their careers. The mortality rate was high, about 60% of participants died, but masters who survived multiple fights developed a reputation that became its own weapon. When you faced a known master, you fought not just his blade but his reputation. You knew he'd survived multiple lethal encounters, which meant your techniques probably weren't going to surprise him. This psychological pressure caused opponents to make mistakes, fighting too cautiously or too aggressively, abandoning their training in favor of desperation. And a master was trained to exploit exactly those mistakes. There are accounts of masters deliberately creating openings in their defense, tempting attacks, then countering when the opponent took the bait. One master, Hans Talhofer, wrote a fighting manual in 1467 that included not just techniques but psychological advice. He taught students to control their breathing to manage fear, to maintain aggressive body language even when tired, to use verbal intimidation before the fight began. Combat was total war, physical, mental, emotional, and every advantage mattered. The armor and sword gave a longsword master the tools. The techniques gave him the methods. But the psychological mastery made him truly formidable. When all three elements combined in a single warrior, the result was someone who could stand alone against multiple opponents and expect to survive. Because unlike every other warrior type we've covered, the longsword master didn't rely on tactics, formations, or support. He was the entire system, contained in one armored form with a blade in his hands. And for nearly 300 years, until firearms made armor obsolete, these masters represented the pinnacle of individual martial achievement in European history. From the steel-scaled cataphract who turned armor into an unstoppable cavalry system, to the samurai who perfected the relationship between blade and protection, to the Templar knight who made defense a science, the Varangian who chose offense over safety, the Rajput who adapted armor to climate and culture, the Janissary who removed humanity to maximize effectiveness, and finally the longsword master who compressed an entire military system into a single warrior. Each found their own answer to the eternal question: how do you master both armor and blade? The techniques have changed. The materials have evolved. But the fundamental challenge remains: creating harmony between protection and lethality, between defense and offense, between survival and victory. These 7 warriors didn't just solve that challenge, they defined it for their eras. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through ancient martial mastery, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the warriors and weapons that shaped history.